Do you want to start, Michael?
Absolutely. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back to Conduct of Life. Let me begin with the first quick logistical statement. Any undergraduate who is not yet sectioned, please do email our extraordinary head TF, Sasha, and he will be sure you get a section soon. And with that very quick logistical statement done, let us turn to now the heart of our discussion. We last week focused on a negative example, an example where, as we argue, the academic world of school philosophy had developed a very, in our opinion at least, restricted vision of ethical questions. And we promised in this course we would try to do the opposite. And now we begin. So, to set out this argument, let me first say a few more words about a topic we discussed relatively briefly in our first session, which is to set the historical ground for these extraordinary philosophical and religious revolutionary movements that absolutely shook the world. Discuss briefly, at least in our opinion, how they unfortunately have been institutionalized and domesticated, and our goals for restoring their power and rethinking their implications for today. So, first, some grand generalizations. If you go back several millennia, so tellingly, prior to the 5th century BCE, and look across all of Eurasia, you will see, of course, tons of variations. However, some generalizations do hold. Those generalizations will go along the following lines. If you look up above, the world consists of a series of, in variously categorized ways of speaking, divinities. Highly, highly capricious divinities. We as humans can organize them in different ways. We can call some of them spirits, some of them ancestors. That will vary. Oftentimes it not only varies by cultural area, but will vary by ritual. Suffice to say, the reason for this variation is the idea that these things up there are very powerful, they are highly capricious, they are far more powerful than humans, and therefore we need to constantly work to accommodate them, mollify them, even to some extent, get them to work on our behalf if possible. And humans, therefore, are in a constant world of potential agonism with these creatures above. If that's what's true above, it's not so different here below with we humans. The key with we humans, and this might or might not be true for them too, that we'll get back to momentarily, but at least for we humans, there is a pre-given hierarchy that we are born into that will define the degree to which we are allowed to, depending on the station in life we are in, work with those things above. Very specifically, what this will mean is as follows. Most Eurasian societies, that's almost putting it too mildly, almost all Eurasian societies in this early period consist of a dramatic social hierarchy in which all power, wealth, and religious access depend exclusively upon birth. If you are a king, it's because you're born into the royal family. If you are a priest, it is because you were born into the priestly family. If you are a peasant, it is because you were born a peasant. There is almost no social mobility whatsoever. And in that pre-given social hierarchy, the degree to which you can maintain your station, only in rare instances that I'll get to momentarily, it's almost impossible to move up, but you can move down, and the degree to which you can maintain your station and not move down is the degree to which you can successfully play your role in that social hierarchy. In the lower social hierarchies, that means doing things like tilling the fields because that's what you're required to do. At the higher levels too, there were defined roles. So, if you're in the priestly or kingly class, depending on how the rituals are set up, you, to maintain your power, must show that you can have access to the most powerful divine figures, to some extent gain their support for things like winning in warfare, harvests, etc. And your station depends on it. If you fail in this, if there's drought, if your armies lose in the wars, it means, among other things, you have failed to maintain that access, and for that reason, you can be overthrown. Not through a peasant revolution, overthrown meaning another powerful aristocratic clan will push you aside and they will take over the royal power. And the same with the priestly class. So to a significant extent, that social hierarchy is based upon the degree to which you can or fail to deal with these capricious creatures above. Now, as I mentioned, there's a little bit of mobility, but little bit being the key word here. In several of these Eurasian societies, you have what are called heroic versions, in which the warrior caste can also do things. They will never gain the power of being a king or a priest, but they can gain fame with some implications that I'll mention. So, if you are born in the warrior caste, what you can do is not only deal with these creatures above, who oftentimes will be throwing things down upon us, and you have to be wily and intelligent to deal with the things they throw upon us, and often on the battlefield, they will play similar games. They will above and play similar games with your enemies, which means if you're a warrior, you must prove yourself on the battlefield, able to defeat your enemies, and able to deal with whatever things that these powers will throw at us. To give a famous example from the Western tradition, if you look back on, say, the Iliad, sort of the Greek attempt to idealize a heroic society of the Bronze Age in Greece, you have, of course, Agamemnon, who is the king by birth. You have Achilles, who is a warrior. If Achilles is able to win on the battlefield and deal with all of the difficulties that the powers above will throw at him, he can gain kleos, fame, which of course he does, and he can be remembered for thousands of years in an epic poem. He can gain posthumous sacrifices as not a divinity, but as a human who dealt with successfully those things above. So the limited degree to which there is flexibility is not real social mobility. It's simply if you're in one of these areas you're born into and play that role effectively, you can gain things that would be the highest possible for that role. If you're a warrior, you can gain fame. If you're a priest and you continue to successfully gain support, you will maintain your role. If you are a king and you can again successfully maintain the support of the divine figures, you will again maintain your power. Summing this up, the world is inherently agonistic, antagonistic, potentially antagonistic, or at least capricious spirits above, enemies outside, and you are born into a social hierarchy and you maintain your position if you can deal with that agonism successfully as your role requires of you. Grand generalizations, and yet it is amazing the degree to which these generalizations hold. That period that we have been discussing is roughly the entire 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE. It's a period known as the Bronze Age, simply because the main metal that's being used by the warriors for their weapons, by the priests for their sacrificial vessels, is bronze. And bronze is a very expensive metal. It is not readily available, and therefore it is controlled by the social hierarchy, and if you're born on top, you have access to the bronze weapons, and you have access to, if you're in the priestly class, the bronze sacrificial vessels. That is Eurasia for roughly 2.5 millennia. Then, as we mentioned very briefly in our first class, the first radical set of revolutions in Eurasia begin midway through the 1st millennium BCE. We have often, in retrospect, called these philosophical movements. As Professor Ungers mentioned, they've often gained the name of axial age philosophical movements. Figures like Confucius, Socrates, the Buddha, placed within these. All of these are roughly contemporaneous, 5th century BCE. But as we have argued, even that designation, axial age philosophers, is a much later and very recent attempt to domesticate them into our restricted notion of philosophy. These were radical figures calling on a truly a revolution against everything we have been discussing. To make, again, some grand generalizations, for which, surprisingly, there are a few exceptions, these revolutions involve the following sets of claims. First of all, most will involve a radical rethinking of the world above. Either it is not the case that the world above consists of antagonistic spirits, or in some cases, as we will see in a few weeks, it is, but we, humans, should not be trying to actually alter them. Our goal is to live our lives and build our world without concern for their attempts to control us. In other versions, the argument is much stronger that we need a new theology that will radically eradicate this entire vision of these things above. Why is this argument being made? For the next one, which for most of these philosophers is what they most care about. Insofar as we either will radically rethink what is above us, or, say, ignore it, what that means is the focus is toward the human. And insofar as the entire social hierarchy of the Bronze Age was based upon abilities to deal with them above, as well as fight enemies, which are seen as along the same sorts of lines in that agonistic worldview, the argument is, therefore, what we focus on is radical self-transformation, radical transformation of the social world, and therefore a radical transformation of all of the assumptions that underlay these Bronze Age religions and societies. Insofar as they are doing so, what they will therefore strongly advocate are various sorts of practices that will entail that radical revolution. Almost across the board, these will be practices available to, and I'll hedge my bets here slightly to keep the generalizations working largely across the board, open to almost everyone, or at least potentially open to everyone. We will get back to those restrictions. However, the generalization that does hold is a radical rejection of the social hierarchy of the Bronze Age. So if you are not born into the priestly or kingly class, the argument is you absolutely have access to the teachings that are being given, and through those teachings you can gain some sort of extreme access to divine power or even divinity in the self. A radical rejection of the social hierarchy because of this radical rejection of the world above. All of these movements, beginning again in the 5th century BCE, and this will continue for about 2 to 3 more centuries, all of them will end up being picked up in various ways by a series of empires that take over pretty much all of Eurasia, beginning in the 2nd, 1st millennium, centuries BCE. When that happens, you will not be surprised to hear, you see the first stage of something we will be talking about repeatedly in this course, which is that all of these will be institutionalized and domesticated in ways to support a new social hierarchy. When that happens, you then, beginning in first centuries of the Common Era, again, across all of Eurasia, roughly contemporaneous, you see the emergence of salvific religions, which are largely attempts to continue the work of the 5th, 4th, and 3rd century BCE earlier movements, but now at an often even more radical stage. These salvific religions begin developing again, 1st century of the Common Era, and will continue for about 6 to 7 more centuries as new ones continue to emerge. And then someplace around 800 of the Common Era, this radical period of revolution will also come to an end. And once again, you will see those very salvific religions being picked up by states. I mean, that's happening throughout this entire period. I just mean by 800 BC of the Common Era, it's now successful. They are picked up by various states, again, institutionalized and domesticated, and their revolutionary power, of course, by definition, radically undercut, if not lost altogether. Our goal in this class, therefore, will be to return us to the radical power of these teachings. We will jump happily between these 5th through 3rd century BCE movements and the salvific religions. We will not be concerned with chronology. We will actually organize the course around powerful moments in these two radical periods. And we will try to find out what made them tick in their most exciting and radical form. We will also ask how they came to be domesticated and institutionalized, are largely as sad issues for us, but those sad issues are also telling. It's not random how you will institutionalize and domesticate these movements. And oftentimes the way they become domesticated and institutionalized is telling about aspects of the teachings themselves. Aspects where, as we will see, there's extraordinary power, but oftentimes elements that are self-limiting and that allow that institutionalization to occur in ways that restrict their radical power. And we do all of this, of course, for our larger goal, which is to ask, now, how do we restore these ideas to their radical power, which by definition will mean rethinking them for a very different time period than when they were first developed, and hopefully learning from the ways they were institutionalized and domesticated to allow this reformulation to open up new possibilities yet again. With that, as a set of grand generalizations, let us jump into the first of these. Again, as we mentioned, we will not be doing these chronologically. We are actually going to be organizing these according to various themes that we think will actually work powerfully in juxtaposition as the weeks go by. And so we turn today to early Christianity and its later institutionalization and attempts to be rethought in the modern period. So, having set up through these grand generalizations what is going on, let me now begin the first stage of this work for Christianity by trying to give you a sense of the radical power of these ideas. I say to give you a sense because, as we will see repeatedly, every single one of these movements we will be dealing with, because they've become so institutionalized and so domesticated, a lot of the words, a lot of the terms, a lot of the practices, a lot of the theologies in this case, don't strike us as terribly radical anymore, to put it mildly. So let me begin by trying to give that power, then discuss the domestication, and then turn to what we can do now. So to begin with the radical power. So let's return to some of these themes we were just looking at. The world above consists of a series of capricious figures. These capricious figures we do not understand. We try to deal with them and mollify them with various ritual practices, divination, sacrifices, when none of these work, exorcisms to just get rid of them. All of these attempts are ways of dealing with them. They're more powerful than us. We also, again, don't really understand them, which is why we'll categorize them in different ways. That one's a spirit, that one's an ancestor, this one's a nature spirit, and then another ritual you'll do it differently because we honestly don't know what they are, but they're just really, really powerful and potentially very, very scary. So, what in Christianity lies above? It is a deity, one. Now, let me immediately note the radical power of this. You might think, oh, but there have been monotheisms throughout Eurasian history. Not really, or rather brief moments of them, but even then, not really monotheistic. I mean, to give the famous example, early Judaism is not really monotheistic. If you look at the early scriptures, the argument is very clear. Yahweh is saying, do not offer cult to the other gods. That's very different from saying they don't exist. It's saying, well, of course they exist, but don't offer cult to them. They're lesser. Do not offer cult to them. Offer it only to me. I am the only God that deserves your worship. A radical claim, but very different from a monotheistic claim. In Christianity, there is one God. That God created the world, and that God has actively intervened in human history, both setting us up and actively guiding us. Moreover, that God is not a God that we can sway or mollify with sacrifices. True, that God is incomprehensible to us. However, unlike the polytheistic deities of the Bronze Age, there is no way through sacrifices that we are going to mollify God in any way. More importantly, it would be absurd to do so, because God is not potentially antagonistic to us. God may at times appear to us capricious, but that's not because God is capricious. It's because we fail to understand God's larger project. What actually drives God is love for us. God is a salvific deity who is trying to save us. And if we cannot alter him through sacrifice, it's not that we should simply get rid of sacrifice altogether, or putting it more strongly, we humans should get rid of sacrifice altogether. But one of the powerful moves of Christianity is to pick up the theme of sacrifice and completely turn it around. Sacrifice is not something we humans do to mollify, build connections with, work with to whatever limited degree we can, spiritual powers above. God himself, as an act of love, has committed the sacrifice for us. It's coming down. And he committed the sacrifice by sending his own son down to be sacrificed, because by that sacrifice, his own son will take upon himself our sins, and therefore open for us the possibility of redemption and salvation that we ourselves cannot attain, nor do we have any religious means to attain it, because sacrifice and divination have been taken off the table. The sacrifice is coming down from a deity, and that sacrifice is an act of radical love. Moreover, insofar as that act of radical love has now occurred, all humans potentially can break down the social hierarchies they were born into, and through love alone, build a new community. Through love alone. I emphasize that strongly. So much of this has become domesticated. We sort of read these texts like, yeah, right. Let me emphasize how radical this is. It is absurdly counterintuitive. It's also absurdly impossible. I mean, of course, how are you going to rebuild a society based upon love? It's an incredibly counterintuitive, absurdly impossible position. That's the point. Many of the Bronze Age religions work because they seem, frankly, kind of intuitive. Not to us, but I mean, if you think about it, it's a capricious world. We try to deal with capricious worlds through our practices. We might not do sacrifices, but if you think about it, it makes sense as a worldview. Christianity in its early formulation makes no sense as a worldview, absolutely none. It is a radically, radically counterintuitive position. And insofar as it calls on a new world with open access, anyone can become a believer, anyone can build this new community through love, anyone therefore can be part of this project of overthrowing the existing hierarchy. It is a position based upon an active attempt to completely take out what had now become the major institutionalized form that had already begun appropriating the earlier 5th through 3rd century BCE movements, namely the Roman Empire. And the call was this entire empire should be eradicated in its present form, and a new community should be developed. Now, we of course know the next stage of this, and so I will be briefer here. The next stage, of course, is one that we will see happening to every single movement that we will be discussing, but it's something we need to wrestle with in terms of its implications and how we can rethink what happens. The Roman Empire, of course, once this becomes a significant religion, adopts it, and it becomes the imperial religion of Rome. When the Roman Empire falls, of course, all of Europe returns to a social world directly comparable to the earlier Bronze Age, where all positions of wealth and power are controlled exclusively through birth. An hereditary elite controls all power. If you're born into that elite, if you're born into the peasant class, there you will remain. There is no social power and there's no social mobility. And indeed, that entire social arrangement is now given a Christian claim, because the argument is God has created what came to be called the Great Chain of Being. In that Great Chain of Being, the world created by God, Everything in the entire cosmos, most certainly including humans, is based in a particular hierarchy. Everything is born into a position in that hierarchy. We humans are born into positions in that hierarchy. And our goal to be good Christians is to live properly in our pre-given, God-given, I should even say, role. And then we will die, and if we've done our role properly, we will achieve salvation because of Jesus. But all of this now is in terms of maintaining a pre-given social order. Exactly what, again, these movements beginning in the 5th century BCE, and again, in the salvation religions, including most certainly Christianity, were trying, at their most powerful formulation, to overthrow. So, I won't continue that history because it's relatively well known, but suffice to say that history has hardly ended. So, our question is, how do we restore the power of Christianity? And particularly, how do we restore it if we take out what, among other things, were the dangers we can see historically that it fell into, or rather that it became appropriated through, but those were in part doctrines that were limiting factors that allowed this to occur, that we can hopefully rethink. Most obviously, one of them is it is still a faith-based tradition, yes, with open access, but that faith-based tradition is based upon faith in the one deity. If you accept the doctrines of that deity, then, of course, you have all that we just mentioned, which, of course, makes it incredibly easy to say, which is exactly what happens in the Roman Empire, some people will have the power to understand what those doctrines are. Those who can understand what those doctrines are, of course, the ones who will therefore control access to that divine power. Those will, of course, become priests. Those priests will, of course, be supported by the ruling class, in this case, the Roman emperors, who themselves, of course, will have access because they can work with a priest. In other words, a flawless replication of Bronze Age religions. In other words, yes, it is radical universal love, and I mean radical, and yet it is radical universal love based upon the degree to which one accepts this one divinity and has faith in him and him alone, which opens up the dangers. Now, I don't mean to imply that that becomes a stable category. What I really want to emphasize on the contrary is the tension. This will create a tension that will start playing out throughout the entire history of Christianity, very much to including the present day. So, movement after movement after movement, both within what will later become defined as the Catholic Church, as well as the other churches, the other traditions, the Orthodox tradition, etc., will be attempts to rethink this. You will then get these heretical movements that were defined early as heretical, that will then become the basis of the Protestant Revolution and many others too, that will all involve a claim to return to an earlier Christianity, breaking from the hierarchy that had come to control it. That is still continuing, but of course, each of these always falls in danger of yet again replicating that very hierarchy, which means for us, what would it mean to build upon the power of this vision without what has historically clearly been its limiting factor, a limiting factor that has so far prevented each of these substantive attempts at radical reform and even self-proclaimed revolution from ultimately being successful. What would it mean? Does it mean taking out the theology and secularizing it? Well, no, that's hardly a new idea. You could argue, in fact, I would argue, many certainly have, that much of 19th and 20th century history consists of simply a secularization of these ideas. So basically, as we discussed briefly last week, much of liberalism, as it develops in the West in the 19th and 20th centuries, is simply a secularization of Christianity. A secularization that, as we noted last week, hardly maintained its radical impulse. On the contrary, as we noted, all of these ideas, once as they become secularized in that form, take on this very limiting sensibility of what is actually possible for humans. So simply secularizing the theological notions is not in itself the solution. What then is. What would it mean to actually take these notions of universal love, but radically rethink them such that they will not be so easily controlled and domesticated and institutionalized that would allow us to maintain their incredible power? And how would one do it that would avoid the problems and pitfalls that have been attempted in simply the move toward a secular liberalism that, again, for all of its great powers, have ultimately proved limiting in terms of ultimately where this could go? I offer all of this as an introduction because, as you well know, sitting next to me, Professor Unger is one of the most powerful thinkers in trying to do this very work. So let me first open things up for questions about this, and then I will turn things over to Professor Unger. But first, questions about this basic historical background to the emergence of Christianity. Please, yes?
This is not so much a question, but I do want to push back against.
Please.
Nowadays, historical Jesus research, the main, I don't want to say consensus because it's hard to use that word in such a big field, but it is that Christianity emerged first as a millenarian religion.
Very much.
Apocalyptic religion.
Yes, very much so.
So Jesus' original intention, if this
Yes.
if this is correct, was not so much as to provide, to say, okay, we should make society this way. It was more the idea that God was about to bring about the apocalypse. And
Right.
right after that event would happen, then the kingdom of God.
Yes.
So it wasn't us who were going to bring this perfect society.
Precisely.
It was going to come from above.
Yes.
And the issue was the kingdom of God never appeared. And
Yes.
then you start having this disruption Christianity.
Yes.
So how would that perspective change what you said?
Oh, no, I think it's a wonderful addition to exactly these points, and I'll underline its significance by just giving another example. At roughly the same time, on the other end of Eurasia, basically the same thing happens. So there is a radical millenarian movement. It's called the Celestial Masters. I'll quickly get to a name that will come to be known later that you will recognize immediately, but this is a radical apocalyptic movement. It calls for an end to all sacrifice and divination, a faith in the one deity who has created generated, I'll come back to that verb, generated a perfectly good world. Humans, however, through their bad actions, have developed this extraordinarily dangerous social hierarchy that is also bringing the entire cosmos into danger. That cosmos is about to end. New revelations have now been sent by this higher deity, and in these new revelations, a call is for people to immediately reject the existing empire. It's called the Han Empire, roughly contemporaneous with the Roman Empire, create their own autonomous community that will be, it's not radically egalitarian, but the hierarchy is radically open in terms of birth, so anyone through spiritual practices can move up in the ranks. And here too, underlining your point, it is an apocalyptic movement. If people do this, they, when the cosmos comes to an end, because it's going to come to an end, they will live out the apocalypse, become the seed people for a new world that will emerge after the apocalypse, and there you will have the full emergence of the world being actively done by this early community, following the dictates of a higher divinity. I might add, much later, this movement comes to be called Taoism, which is how we know it, and we'll be discussing it later in this semester. This emerges in the first century of the Common Era, opposite end of Eurasia, basically the same move. And yes, getting back to your point, all of what I said, with only minor variations of wording, holds for these early Christian communities too. So you're absolutely right. It is the power, but potentially, depending on how one defines it historically, its limiting factor is, yes, all of this still depends on the active intervention of this deity. Not only is he the one who has sacrificed his own son for us, but as you said, he is the one, or his son is the one, who will bring about this new kingdom. And essentially the work we are doing now is preparing for that, exactly as is true for the Celestial Masters. And I emphasize that parallel to say, in both cases, the question is, once, as you said, the apocalypse doesn't happen, and these both become institutionalized movements, Christianity on the one hand, Taoism on the other hand, then it creates all of the tensions that we've been discussing. So yes, a long answer, the short version is yes, thank you. I think that's a wonderful issue to bring into the conversation. Yes. Yes, please.
Yes, to his question, I disagree with what you said, the last point that you said, that I guess becoming kingdom is parallel with the work that's being done now, or the work that people have done, even though I guess there's some elements of apocalypse in Christ, or in what Christ has said in the Gospels, he still tells people to go out
Yes.
to evangelize.
Yes.
Their work is still a part of it to the extent that they become part of the body of Christ.
Yes.
But my question was on
Yes.
the earlier characterization of the Bronze Age.
Mm-hmm.
With the Iliad as an example, would you agree that I guess the social hierarchy, for example, on the battlefield, less that it's defined, like less that if you're born can't gain fame or playoff, but, or I feel the ideology is more that only those who are born into
Right.
it even have the potential to.
Yes.
Not like any other soldier
Yes.
would be stopped from being Achilles by the
Right.
king if they became it. But
Yes.
they're just unable to be like Achilles, or they're not as good as Odysseus or the other.
Yes, I think that is exactly right. So again, there's Agamemnon, who is the king, and he's born into that. There are all of those who, which is the vast majority of the army, who work on behalf of the warriors. So they are the ones who literally will run beside the chariot, fixing the wheels, handing weapons to the warriors. And so exactly as you said, the only ones who can attain fame, kleos on the battlefield, are the warriors, and the warriors are born into that. So we're talking about the warrior class. Those born into it, exactly as you said, they can obtain kleos, fame, through their actions. But yes, those running beside Achilles, handing him weapons, they cannot attain fame. They can be at best helpful people before they get killed, but they will never have epic poems written about them. They will never gain posthumous sacrifices to them. So yes, so it is absolutely a world of social hierarchy. You're born into it. If you're a king, Agamemnon, you're a king. If you're a priest, you're a priest. If you're born a warrior, you're Achilles. And if you play your role well, in the case of a warrior, gaining fame on the battlefield, then you have attained all that you can obtain. But Achilles, absolutely, you're right, can never become the king. He attains fame, but even if he had survived the Iliad, yes, he would never become the king. You're absolutely right. Other questions? Yes, please.
So in restoring the power of early Christianity, is the goal simply to have a tradition that dismantles hierarchy rather than reinforces it? Like, what's the ultimate goal, and what is salvageable from early Christianity?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a wonderful segue to the next part of the today's session, but let me just say a few words before I turn it over to Professor Unger. I would say what is salvageable would be the radicalness of a vision of community based upon something so absurdly counterintuitive and impossible as love. And if we're going to salvage this, we're going to have to rethink the concept of love. Since it would have to be more than just the love coming down from a higher deity who we are awaiting the intervention of, but something else. And yet, were we to be able to reformulate that in a way that wouldn't simply be its secularization into being altruistic, as we discussed last week, then could we develop a vision of what it would mean to have a radical critique of existing social hierarchies and an ongoing critique, so you're not dependent upon either an interventionist deity, you're not dependent upon any singular event, either the coming down of the sun the first time for the sacrifice or the coming down for the second time of the second coming, but rather a constant possibility of revolution, precisely because it would build into itself through this rethinking of a community based upon love, that kind of work. I'm not implying any of this is easy, but that's kind of the point. If we restore the power, the just absurdly counterintuitive power of early Christianity, we need to be equally strong in the absurdly counterintuitive vision of what it would mean today, so it doesn't simply become a secularized form of altruism. And thank you. It's both a wonderful question and I think a perfect segue. So, Professor Unger, let me turn things over to you.
So I'm going to begin by making some remarks about the naturalistic or secular meaning of Christianity. The meaning of Christianity when it is translated into a discourse that doesn't overtly appeal to the conception of God's redemptive intervention in history and our interactions with God. Of course, for the Christian, for the believer, these things are inseparable. That is, the moral conceptions acquire their deeper meaning when they're placed in this larger context. But it's nevertheless important to try to understand the moral message, even without explicit reliance on the larger context. And that's what I'm going to try to do now, in defining what, to my mind, are the two central ideas of Christianity viewed from this perspective. Now, this is a problem of great consequence for us in the West, because it seems that the highest achievements of our civilization, the highest intellectual or cultural achievements, like, say, the plays of Shakespeare or the philosophy of Hegel, are not quite Christian. I think there's reason to think that they're heretical, even though Shakespeare and Hegel regarded themselves as Christians. But they are unthinkable without Christianity. So what is characteristic of the civilization of the West is that its most audacious and creative accomplishments take place, as it were, in the penumbra, in the aftermath of Christianity. And they have this ambivalent relation to Christianity. And so it's very important to try and understand what the core is. So there are two central ideas to my mind. One is the idea of the supremacy of love, which you referred to, Michael. That love rather than altruism is the organizing principle of our moral experience. And the second is the idea of the infinite. That we are the infinite. That we participate in the divine life, and this quality of the infinite, of infinite transcendence, is within us. And the most difficult problem, to my mind, in the understanding of Christianity is to form a conception of the relation between these two ideas. So the nature of love is rendered clearer by contrast to altruism. And I want then to recur to a discussion that we began last week about the difference between altruism and love. So first, for altruism, the fundamental problem is our self-centeredness, our selfishness. And the solution is to tame it. For love, the problem is our reconciliation to the others. Sartre said, the others are hell. So we need the others, but the others place us in jeopardy. How can we be reconciled with them? Go reconcile with your brother before you do anything else, Christ said. So this is the perspective of love. Second, in altruism, there is, of course, the problem of being able to master our selfishness. Very difficult. But there's no imaginative or cognitive difficulty. love has an epistemic threshold. The first problem in love is the ability to imagine the other person. And this turns out to be extremely difficult. The imagination of the other, of the otherness of the other, that our view of the other not be simply a projection of some need or fantasy that we entertain. And so the cultivation of this ability to imagine the other, the otherness of the other person, is the shaping experience in love. Now, third, altruism presupposes no kind of equality, tangible or intangible. Altruism can be given, and often is given, from a distance and from on high. Love requires a fundamental equality. Even though the lovers, the participants in this relation, may have radically different social stations, in the experience of love, they must face each other directly and on an equal plane. And fourth, altruism may require sacrifice. It is defined by sacrifice, and even the ultimate sacrifice of one's own life. But it imposes no inner jeopardy, no inner vulnerability to the other. Love can be refused, it can fail, it can be rebuffed. And therefore, love demands as its condition the heightening of vulnerability. Love requires that we cast down our shields. And so this is a fundamentally different experience. So there I see the defining characteristic of love as a moral experience. And now there's a problem with love, which is not a problem faced by altruism. The problem is that it seems that love cannot flourish out of the circle of intimacy. Love requires direct connection, proximity. And therefore we need a proxy to love outside the circle of intimacy. The proxy could be, for example, the idea of cooperation among free and equal individuals, but the institutional form of this cooperation is always undefined and contested. Now then, the second idea in Christianity, seen in its naturalistic or moral core, and apart from this larger envelope or context, the narrative of God's interaction with us, is the idea of the infinite. We participate in the life of God. And in naturalistic terms, that means that we are the infinite when compared to everything around us. Everything around us is finite. And there's always more in us, in each of us as individuals, and in all of us, the human race, than there is or ever can be in all the social and conceptual worlds that we build and inhabit. They are finite in relation to us, and we are infinite in relation to them. We always spill over. There's this quality of surfeit, of excess, of opposition that we have because we are the infinite to everything particular. Now, in the evolution of our civilization, of Western culture, this idea of the infinite has been subject to two forms of perversion. It has been denatured in two ways. And one of them is it has been denatured by a tradition that you could call existentialist or romantic and also mystical, and I'm going to call it, I've called it before, the Sartrean heresy. Because, you know, it's a tradition of Christianity that you give names to heresies and names of particular individuals. So following this tradition of patristic theology, I'm going to call it the Sartrean heresy. So, but it already existed in Romanticism, in the Romanticism of the 19th century. So the idea is that we're only fully ourselves. We're only completely human and free and divine and infinite in those interludes in which we shake the rule of the structures. So social life is institutionalized. It consists to a large extent in routine and repetition and in institutional form. And the idea is that this routinized and institutionalized form of social life is the hand of Midas that kills the spirit. The spirit, our spiritual freedom, our reaching to the infinite, exists only in the reaching against these institutional forms. And it is in those moments that we become fully ourselves, in which we shake the structures. So, romantic love, as opposed to the routines of married life, or the mob in the streets, the crowd, the revolutionary crowd, as opposed to bureaucratic regularity. So, you know, in the romantic love, the theme is the romance, the pursuit. But what is characteristic of the romantic love is that the marriage itself, the object of desire, is never portrayed, because its routines would be unimaginable to the romantic. It would be an anticlimax. It would have no power to win us over. So it's beyond, it's outside. And that's then what I'm calling the Sartrean heresy, the romantic heresy. And we can criticize it from a Christian standpoint and say it suffers from a deficiency of hope. So it says we can rebel against the structures temporarily, knowing that they'll always come back. That all we can hope for is that magical moment, those interludes of disruption. But disruption will ultimately always fail, and the structure will return. What we can't hope is to change the relation between structure and spirit. We cannot hope to create structures over time that are more hospitable to spirit. But that's precisely what a Christian would say, and what I would say as not a Christian is what we should and must hope for, to change the relation between structure and spirit, and to create structures of a different kind. So that's one way in which this idea of the infinite has been denatured, in which we give up on the project of creating structures that are hospitable to spirit. So, for example, one way in which structures might be more hospitable to spirit is that they facilitate their own revision. So that in being in them, in engaging in them, we don't have to surrender to them. We can be insiders and outsiders at the same time. We can be in them and go about our business, and nevertheless, at each turn, challenge them and revise them and reinvent them. And then they won't be a prison house. And the relation between spirit and structure will begin to change. Now then there's the opposite heresy, the Hegelian heresy. So the Hegelian heresy is that there is a definitive structure. We reach an outcome in which finally all opposition between subjectivity and structure ceases, and we find our home in the world. But Christianity implies, and we independently have reason to believe, that we will never have such a home in the world, even though some structures are better than others, even though there is the possibility of progression. Christ has commanded us, the Redeemer, to be in the world but not of it. And so we cannot mistake some arrangement in the world for the natural home of the Spirit. In Christianity, this was another heresy, an actual heresy, called Pelagianism, that we could save ourselves through the creation of a certain kind of structure. So we have these two ideas, the idea of the infinite, the idea of our radical transcendence, and the idea of the primacy of love over altruism. And the next question is, what is the relation between these two ideas? This is, I think, one of the greatest mysteries about this way of thinking about the world. So you can say, it is in love, the defining moral experience, that we are able to recognize one another as the radical originals that we all want to be or imagine ourselves to be, the context transcending individuals who are not defined simply by the performance of a collection of social roles. But the trouble is, of course, that we are not yet these individuals. These individuals required or presupposed by love. We must make ourselves into them over time. So it's not simply that we affirm that we already are these people, which have this quality of the infinite. We must become them. And how do we become them? Then we have our revolutionary political projects. And to the extent that we don't become them in politics, we must nevertheless find a way to do that, to achieve that aim in the conduct of life, in the way in which we orient our lives. So morals must make up for the omissions and failures of politics. Now, unlike Hegel and Shakespeare, I don't regard myself as a Christian. But I would say this view that I've stated in purely naturalistic and secular terms has better credentials to be considered an expression of Christian orthodoxy than the views that they stated. So before going any step further, let me stop there, because I've made already significant claims about the core of this set of ideas. Yes?
I was wondering if the Christian idea of sacrificial love mixes your categories of altruism and love. There's like one example of John 15:13, where there's no greater love than to lay one's life for one's friends. And you kind of put that in the altruism category. And then other examples, God sending his son as the greatest act of love, being a sacrifice.
Yes.
At least it kind of mixes the categories of altruism and love.
Well, of course, and there's a great deal of explication of Christianity that makes it sound like altruism. And then there are the words like charity rather than love, in the translations of Paul's epistle. So it's true, there's this equivocation. But it's different still. I mean, I still make the claim. The essential task, the aim, is not just altruism, it's love. Because altruism is compatible with what I called in an earlier conversation of ours, the middle distance, like Schopenhauer's porcupines. and settling into the middle distance and giving something from afar. That's not enough for a Christian. There has to be this intimate reconciliation. We have to look into the face of the other. We have to recognize the other. There has to be this encounter. That's the transformative moment. That's what we desire. It goes beyond the middle distance.
So you say the sacrifice part of the love is more of a byproduct.
Well, so sacrifice, of course, can be informed by love. God became man out of love, we would say, not out of altruism, out of love for humanity. God needs humanity. And so the sacrifice was informed by love, and the sacrifice is a transformative event. It's not just some kind of placation of the divinity informed by love. And so that's a different moral horizon. And so that's what I would say. Yes.
Well, I'm gonna say maybe a little bit controversial, but isn't there something good about the institutionalization of this radical idea? Because behind all of this, there is also a latent danger. For example, when Marxism, for example, was, even though Marxism was admitted, was an attempt, perhaps, of bringing the kingdom of God.
Even though what? What word? What was the word?
Marxism
Yes.
was an attempt of bringing this radical transformation, bringing the kingdom of God into the earth by
Uh-huh.
the hand of man. And when we try to bring a Bolivarian project into practice, then you end up on this one very hazardous society. So isn't there a way in which this radical transformation also has this danger behind it? And even in Christianity itself, when Jesus talks about the coming of the kingdom of God, well, some of them are going to be saved, but some of them are not. There's also this, on the other hand, of this radical idea of love, this radical idea of eternal damnation for those who don't understand Jesus' salvation.
Well, this is another set of problems in Christianity. This problem of predestination, of salvation, of damnation. And that's another very long argument. So,
I think my point is that behind this idea of a radical transformation, there is also this idea of raising violence. Exactly, a violence that can destroy the social fabric.
yes, but the premise of the transformation, of the transformations that are envisioned in Christianity is the spiritual freedom of the individual. Right? The individual can reject God, but that's because the individual, in a sense, is God and participates in the divine life and has this higher dignity, this faculty. So that's this conception of our radical transcendence as individuals. Each of us is the living God. And this is the conception that is so hard to understand. And the intimate basis for this relation between the idea of the infinite and the idea of the primacy of love. We are God. And we participate in the eternal life of God.
But when these ideas are put into practice for us, it's a social project.
Yes. Yes, so that's then, of course, the beginning of the trouble. Now, because first of all, in philosophical terms, clearly to distinguish this view from Romanticism, from what I call the Sartrean heresy, it's not that we imagine that we can prescind from institutions, from routine, from repetition. Kierkegaard said the war against repetition is a war against life. Life is full of repetition. But, and so that leads to the idea that we have to stop the repetition. We have to disrupt. There has to be disruption. And the disruptors are the spiritual aristocracy of the human race. But the question is whether the disruption is simply this hopeless interlude, or whether it has an ongoing transformative effect, whether there is a possible ascent through disruption to a different kind of relation between spirit and structure. That's the question that's posed. Now, just to go on to the sort of the next stage of the discussion. So Christianity in its historical life entered into two sets of compromises, which imperiled it, but are part of its historical reality. So one set of compromises are relations with the particular societies and their institutions, their moral codes, and so forth. So there are a set of compromises with particular regimes. And the history of the moral opinions of humanity is the history of these compromises in the West. So, for example, it entered into European medieval society, and the ethic of chivalry is a compromise between the hierarchical order of feudalism and Christianity, in which Christianity was obviously denatured in some way. Then look at the 19th century Victorian ethic of family piety and respectability, informed by Christian ideas about the sanctity of marriage and of the family, but at the same time denaturing Christianity because it presents a particular hierarchy, etc. So, and this is the real history of Christianity. It's entered as part of its engagement with the world. It's formed these compromises with the different regimes that have existed. And the result of the compromises are the ethics which have in fact prevailed. Now, there's a second kind of compromise, which is a compromise with the philosophical traditions. So something very strange happened in the history of Christianity, which is that Christianity made a deal, as it were, a compromise, with the Greek philosophy of being. The most influential philosophers, and this didn't happen just in Christianity. It happened in all three of the Semitic monotheisms. It happened in Judaism with Maimonides. It happened in Islam with Averroes. And it happened in Christianity with Aquinas. Aristotle, the philosophy of Aristotle, the philosophy of being. And there's a problem with the category of being. So that compromise with philosophy, with Greek philosophy, was aggravated by another feature later of the history of modern philosophy, which is that modern philosophy in Europe has been shaped by a series of dualisms, of divisions. And the first of those dualisms actually appeared late in the Middle Ages. We call it sometimes the nominalist philosophy. It's the division between the realms of nature and grace. So, and it says there's a fundamental division between the divine part of ourselves and the natural part. The natural part can't ascend. Nature is spiritless. This was prefigured in the history of Christianity by the Nestorian heresy. The human and the divine are separate. And this is clearly heretical, because in the Hebrew Bible, God says, I will pour out my spirit onto all flesh. The spirit will be immanent. It will penetrate the world. So we had these dualisms that began in the Middle Ages. Then there's the dualism between mental stuff and physical stuff in Descartes. Then there's the dualism between the things and themselves and the phenomenon. And in the 19th century, the historicist dualism between the realm of nature and the realm of humanity, of history. So I think what you could say is this is a completely inappropriate philosophical background to Christianity. But that's what Christianity relied on. So if you add these two sets of compromises, the social ideological compromises and the philosophical compromises, they form quite a force of degradation, of perversion of Christianity. So Christianity has struggled through these two sets of compromises. And that then leads me, those observations lead me then to ask, what then would be the appropriate philosophical background to Christianity? What are its presuppositions? And how are we to see it against the larger background of world philosophy? So I would say, first, so let's make a list of the philosophical assumptions required by Christianity. First is, there is one real world. And the most important thing about the world is that it is what it is and not something else. So the world is radically contingent, but it has a particular nature which we would be unable to conjecture or to invent. And we can't deduce it from any rational necessity, as the rationalist philosophers attempted. Second, time is real. And time includes everything. Nothing is outside of time. So everything changes, including change itself. There is no permanent structure of the world and immutable laws of nature outside of time. And this is very important because in Christianity, time is the fundamental dimension in which God acts. And the human beings participate in time. Their temporality is essential to them. Now, third, then, the new is possible. Christianity is about transformation, about novelty. And the new in a much more radical way than we are inclined to imagine. So our conception of the new, our ordinary conception of the new, is that there are possible states of affairs. Predefined. There's some set of ideas that can determine what is possible. So the possible states of affairs are like ghosts waiting behind the curtain to come onto the stage of actuality. And what I would call a spectral idea of possibility, as opposed to the idea that the new is really new, and that our conception of possibility is like looking in the rear view mirror. What we imagine to be possible is formed by what happened. So it's not that there's the possible and then it's actualized. It's that something changes in the world and then retrospectively we enlarge our view of possibility. The fourth assumption is that history is open. History is a scene of conflict, of redemption, of creation. It has no script, contrary, for example, to Marxism. The fifth assumption is that the self, because it is infinite and transcendent, has unfathomable depth and obscurity. So we are obscure to one another and even to ourselves. Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher, said, the soul of another person is a dark continent that can never be visited. And this obscurity, then, is a direct consequence of our transcendence. Now comes the sixth assumption. The sixth assumption is that the ordinary, the vulgar, the base, has more spiritual potential than the noble. So this is the anti-hierarchical claim, which leads to this radical transvaluation of values. Ordinary humanity, ordinary men and women, ordinary experience, the everyday, is what has potential to reach the heights. The things that we regard as superior, they're actually lower. It's the things that are, it's from the things that are despised that we may attempt to achieve help for salvation. And so there's this radical inversion of the hierarchies of the world that you, Michael, described. Now, take these six presuppositions that I just stated as the philosophical assumptions of Christianity. And ask how do they relate to the major traditions of the world history of philosophy. So I would say the following. There have been two major traditions in the world history of philosophy. One of them has been the philosophy of being or structure. Begins with the Greeks, and it goes through the whole tradition of modern science. So, including 20th century relativity and quantum mechanics. And it says the world is real, and things change in the world, but the most fundamental things in the world don't change. Nature has an ultimate structure. The structure, for example, described by the standard model of particle physics. And there are immutable laws, constants, and symmetries. Those permanent features are not in time. They're outside of time. So time is real, but not completely real, because there are exceptions to it. And what is most real, which is this abiding structure of the world and the regularities that govern it, is what is least temporal. So that in the West, that has been the dominant philosophical tradition. This idea of a deep structure, which I'm calling the philosophy of being, and it penetrates our dominant tradition of natural science, fundamental science in physics, from Galileo to Einstein. Now there's a second, but it's had opponents in the West, like Schopenhauer, who have sought inspiration in the philosophy of the East, of the ancient India. So then there's a second dominant philosophical tradition, which is what you could call the speculative monism. It says, ultimate reality is unitary and timeless. All the distinctions and changes that appear in the world are illusory or secondary, because the ultimate is timeless and unified. And of course, this speculative monism has different forms, radical forms, qualified forms, like Plato's doctrine of ideas of forms. But nevertheless, in this philosophy, in all its forms, whether radical or qualified, there is the association of reality with timelessness. So what do those two dominant traditions, and this has been the philosophy that dominated ancient India. It made an appearance in China. It's made an appearance in the West through Schopenhauer and to some extent through Leibniz and through Spinoza. But in the West, it was never the dominant philosophy. In other parts of the world, it was. What do these two dominant traditions in the world history of philosophy have in common? The philosophy of deep structure and the philosophy of the timeless one. What they have in common is the association of reality with timelessness. That's what they have in common. So the more real something is, the less temporal it can be. And that's the shared element. Now there is a third position in philosophy, and you might think that it is the most plausible or the one that has the greatest credential to be accepted, but it speaks with the weakest voice in the world history of philosophy. The essence of the third position is very simple. The third position says, everything changes sooner or later. Everything. Including the regularities of nature and the most lasting structures. They all change. Just wait a little more and you'll see them change. Or they have a history. But they're no less real because they change. So everything changes into everything else. There's a transformation. There is no permanent repertory of natural kinds, of types of being. So just like there are animal species and they appear and disappear, everything else that exists in the world, subatomic particles appear and disappear and have a history. There's nothing that's just there forever. Nothing is forever. So and nothing is less real because it is ephemeral, because it is temporal. So this third position dissociates reality from atemporality. Now you might think that that's the position which we might most naturally come to, but it's had very few philosophers on its side. And some in the 20th century, partially, like Bergson and Whitehead, but on the whole, it's been a view that has been disfavored in the world history of philosophy. So what I would say, just to conclude this part of our conversation, is that Christianity has an affinity to this philosophy that I just described, this third position. But that's not what's prevailed. Its official philosophy has been the Greek philosophy of being. The 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger once made this remark. He said, if one day I wrote a theology, the word being would never occur in it. And I think this is what he meant, because the word being comes from this other universe of conceptions, which is contrary to the presuppositions of Christianity. So that's on the philosophical background of Christianity. Maybe I should stop there and ask whether someone would like to question. Do you want to make a comment, Michael, about this?
Sure. I will be extremely brief because I do want to open this up. But just to be very brief, let me underline what Professor Unger is doing and as a way to finally get back in now more fuller form to your question. So, as we've noted, when Christianity has been secularized in the past 2 centuries, it's taken various forms. One of those, discussed last week, is the form of political liberalism, where basically the move is you take God and the sovereign God, who's of course created the world, and you say every individual is a sovereign God. Needless to say, with a radical reduction of what that means, because the sovereign God in political liberalism becomes you are sovereign of your property, and you accept that other sovereigns have their property, and you agree to with basic rules and laws that will allow you to cooperate so you can keep your property but not rob someone else's property. So you secularize the notion of divinity, bring it to the individual, but then radically reduce what that means. And the implication, of course, is we would live properly within that existing liberal order, with the possibilities that we were discussing last week of how you would adjudicate different claims. Another form of secularization, of course, is the historical version, which is, and one version is just the one I mentioned, where history is the working out of a redemptive process, except instead of that process being the final redemption of the second coming of Christ, it's worked out in secular terms. So that final state is the Prussian state for Hegel, a future communist state for Marx. For Fukuyama, it is indeed political liberalism, as we've just been describing it. So you work out all of that version into a secular form. Yet another one, as Professor Unger called it, the Sartrean heresy, is the romantic vision of saying, okay, well, we accept that all the versions we just mentioned involve basically an institutionalization. So there the secularization is to say, yes, but there is divinity within each individual that goes beyond simply the being sovereign of their own property, and that divinity gives them the ability to radically rebel. But that, of course, means, as Professor Unger has argued, that you radically rebel for a little period of time, and then you return to the accepted institutional form. So it's an incredible limitation of what that divinity would mean. So what Professor Unger is bringing to the table is to say, what if we work this out not as a secularization in any of these modes we have been talking about, but what if we do it by returning to the basic philosophical and presuppositions of Christianity, read in their most powerful way, which means actually taking out most of the forms they have actually taken historically, including the entire Greek philosophical vision of being that becomes orthodox by Aquinas, that takes out most of its institutionalized forms, including the secularized forms in political liberalism. And what would it mean if, on the contrary, we build out a vision arguing that all humans are an inherent contradiction of the finite and the infinite? God then is not simply the sovereign individual who controls property, nor the Sartrean radical every once in a while rebelling and then being forced to accept his situation yet again, but rather an inherent contradiction that we live with. And then what would it mean to build out a vision of radical self-transformation through that contradiction, through meaning accepting that contradiction is absolute, and therefore it becomes the fundamental tension through which we work. Once done, the argument then continues to say, let us then work out what this would mean in terms of our understandings of time, our understandings of humans by definition, our understandings of the world, and its ethical and political implications. So this is Professor Unger's attempt to do what we were mentioning when we were saying, how in the world do you build out the power of Christianity, restore its radicalness, and yet avoid the dangers that have happened recurrently throughout its history, including in its secular version of the past 2 centuries in the West? Professor Unger's response is to say, this is the way to build out its philosophical power in a way that would give it that kind of revolutionary flavor that it is at most had momentarily at specific historical moments, and now to work out its full implications. So with that as a very quick statement, let us open this up for responses of any kind. Please.
Well, just so that I understand
Yes.
supremacy of love in the internet. I'm just trying to understand where that leaves the notion of deities and like the theistic belief in this ego or God. Are you moving beyond that, or setting it aside, or
No, well, as I said at the beginning of my discussion, I was prescinding from this larger narrative of the Semitic monotheisms, the narrative of redemption, of God's creative and redemptive activity, and trying to reach the naturalistic core of these religions. So what a Christian thinks is that this naturalistic core acquires a deeper meaning within this larger context, because our relations to one another are analogous to our relation to God. So everything has this deeper meaning. It's read in this deeper register because it has this larger significance. So that's the idea. Now, and this is really something that I should then complement in the discussion. So then we have the problem of faith and what we are to make of faith in a secular moral discussion, like the discussion of the two visions that we're ultimately going to come to in this course, the two contemporary secular ethics. There are these scandals of reason. So in the Semitic monotheisms and in Christianity in particular. So first there's the scandal of supernaturalism. God's intervention in the world suspends the normal causal laws in some way. The virginal birth of Jesus, or the resurrection, and what we're taught to believe in our natural scientific study of the world is that once some of the causal connections are suspended, all bets are off, because everything else might be different. So how can we think that we can suspend part of them without putting all of them into question? So that's the first scandal. Now, the second scandal is the scandal of the relation in these religions and in their narrative of creation of redemption between a universal message and a particular plot. Why is the universal message mediated through a very particular plot? So Jesus was born at a particular time in a peripheral province of the Roman Empire as a Palestinian peasant or zealot. Why? Why not this time rather than that time? Why not in one form rather than another, and so forth? So this makes it hard to grasp this contradiction between the universality of the message and the particularity of the plot. Now, the third scandal is the scandal of the conception of God. So, theologically, it's very hard to form a conception of God that is both coherent and able to perform the function that the conception of God must perform in the religion. So, there are three conceptions of God in these religions, the Semitic monotheisms. There's God as being. And then there's a problem, because God acts as a person. And as I said, our relations to him are analogous to the relations we have with people. God can't be... So in Christianity, the personal is higher than the impersonal. The personal has supremacy over the impersonal. And everything happens in the dimension of time, which is the dimension of personal being. So the philosophy of being delivers these two insults to Christianity of affirming the supremacy of the impersonal over the personal and denying or undermining the reality of time. Now, the second conception of God is a person then. But that's an overtly anthropomorphic and anthropocentric conception of God. How can we understand God as if he were just some bigger version of us? Is God like some Gulliver, and we're the Lilliputians? And that's then subject to a series of familiar problems, right? And then there's the third conception of God, which is the negative conception, the conception that has prevailed in the mystical countercurrents of these three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. What is God? God is non-person and non-being. God is defined by simple negation. And then the problem is that this is just a vacuum. So it's not a positive conception of God. It's a conception simply by denial or by negation. Now, we can add to those three scandals of reason a fourth scandal, which is kind of obvious, but it has a fundamentally different character, which is the vast majority of believers are believers because their parents were believers in the same religion. And conversion is a tiny fraction of belief. And in no other field of human knowledge or discourse do we think that it's reasonable to believe something because our parents believed it. So it's this presents an obvious problem. Now, why am I stating these scandals of reason? I'm stating them because they're the preliminary to a fundamental problem that we have in the appeal to religion in our world, which is that the characteristic attitude of the modern sensibility when faced with these scandals of reason is to begin to demythologize the religion, to treat it as if it were an allegory or a set of metaphors for something else that could be stated in purely secular terms. And then there is the characteristic attitude of half belief. So, do you believe or not believe? You want to believe. So there's the sentimental wish to believe. William James said once, people believe everything they can. So the way then, a common way in which to appropriate these ideas is to reduce them in allegorical or metaphorical form. And what results then is this halfway house between faith and the lack of faith, in which a large number of people then want to believe. And the wanting to believe is then this sentimental form of religion. Now, I think this is very dangerous. And it's very dangerous for two different reasons. First of all, it's dangerous for a cognitive reason, because it's a form of self-deception, and in which we're not being honest with ourselves, we're not clarifying the foundations of belief. We either have faith or we don't have faith. But it's also dangerous for a second reason, which is if you examine the content of the demythologized religion, what you find is simply a repetition of the conventional secular humanistic pieties of the day. So the erosion of faith produces a simulacrum of the religion, and in which the religion is simply a mirror, becomes simply a mirror to us of our conventional beliefs, like our beliefs about the importance of love, of altruism, and so forth. Well, we don't need religion for that. We need religion to be a storm that comes to us unintended, uninvited, picks us up and moves us in a direction in which we didn't want to go. And if that's not what religion is, then why do we need it? So I think this is the problem with the halfway house between belief and unbelief, which has now been part of this general culture. And I suspect that atheism and true belief can be much closer to each other than either of them is to this halfway house, to this sentimentalized form of religion, which is most likely then to deny what is truly subversive about the religion, what is unsettling, what is disturbing, what leads us in a different direction. And all of this is extremely aggravated in a society like this one, in our contemporary societies, because there is a taboo against the religious criticism of religion. It's regarded as somehow inappropriate. And of course that taboo can't be accepted, either on the basis of our beliefs in democracy or on the basis of our taking religion seriously. We can't accept the taboo on the religious criticism of religion. The religion should be able to attack each other, and the religious and the anti-religious views to attack each other openly, and that has to be part of the conversation. So that's this larger reality that we find ourselves in. And I think that of all the things that could happen, one of the worst would be to end up with a sugar-coated, diluted, watered-down, saccharine form of Christianity. We don't need that. We need something else. We need some version of the storm. That's what it was. That's how it came to us. Yes.
Just to clarify, kind of going back to something
Yes.
you mentioned earlier in class. I know part of the course is like asking ourselves how do we restore the radical nature of these various ideas or
Yes.
philosophies or but I just really want to understand, like I understand that love is a central component in the Christian tradition. Why would we want to restore that idea as something in modern times? Like what about love in the Christian sense is so potentially valuable for us as that we would want to be considered?
Well, I'll state my assumption. I actually agree with Christianity in this respect. I think love is a much higher form of moral experience than altruism. So, because it relates to these contradictions of our being, of our freedom. As I said, one of them is self and other. How can we connect with, unless we can connect with the others without losing ourselves, we're not free. And we're not free just in some narrow political sense. We're not alive. We don't come into the possession of life. To come into the possession of life, we have to resolve those contradictions. So I think this is the remarkable feature of this religion, that you could say, what is the religion about other than love? The religion is about life. It says eternal life, but it really means, or it can mean also, life period, coming into the possession of life right now. Because all we ever have is the present moment. We don't have the future, we don't have the past, we have the present. How can we live in the present moment as beings who are not completely shaped by the present determinations of their existence? And that's what living for the future means. So I would say the idea of the supremacy of love comes from that world of beliefs in which our supreme objective is not to discharge our obligations and go faultless to the grave with clean hands, as the philosophers want us to do. Our supreme objective is to come into the possession of life. And Christianity is more instructive than the post-Christian moral philosophy in showing us how to do that. So I am interested in it. I do agree with it that love is higher than altruism. And so altruism is the background to this moralistic legalism of the moral philosophers. I don't want that.
So in your conception, I guess, it seems that human connection plays a particularly important role to living.
No, but it's something more fundamental. So the question is, how do we come to life? So how do we become alive and freer in this larger sense? So one way is we connect with others without giving ourselves up. Another way is we engage in a particular world without surrendering to it. And a third way is we develop a coherent way of being, but we don't allow it to rigidify to such an extent that the mask becomes the person and replaces the living self. So the supreme theme is life and coming to life and intensely. Now is eternity. And that's a Christian way of thinking. So I would say that way of thinking is immensely instructive. Whether or not we accept the truth of this background of the story of creation and redemption. And in deciding what our attitude is to that background, we better stay away from this halfway house between faith and unfaith. We better not begin to equivocate with ourselves and to confuse religion with this sentimental will to believe, which is now the predominant attitude. But that's another debate. Yes.
Because I wonder how the philosophical assumptions of Christianity relate to the previous assumptions.
Can you speak more loudly, please? With trouble hearing here.
What the philosophical assumptions of Christianity talk about the vision of nature in that time when
Uh-huh.
arose and it has changed over time.
Well, nature's not, of course, in these religions, nature is not sacred. We can have responsibilities to it, which are in part responsibilities to other creatures and responsibilities to one another, to our ability to use nature, but we don't sanctify nature. Because that would be a form of paganism.
And the previous religions did, right?
So, but then there's this question, when I refer to the dualism of nature and grace, the nominalist wave of dualism, it says, nature in us is a different thing. Because nature in us is already penetrated by spirit. And it ascends with us, or otherwise we don't ascend. So it's not just our mental nature that ascends. All of us, we have to ascend. We have to go up. So that's part of this idea. Nature associated with humanity is also divine in Christianity. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. There, back there.
There seems to me like there's a tension between the idea that time is real as an assumption in Christianity, and also that change is almost inevitable, everything changes in Christianity, and sort of just at the same time trying to go back to find the original Christianity that hasn't changed and trying to keep that from changing. So how do we reconcile the sort of just this course of trying to keep the original form, but also letting it change as well?
I'm not sure I understand. So the religion has a history also, right? So what are you saying? There's a contradiction between the observation that everything changes and the idea that the early descent, that the canonical form of the message at the time of the foundation of the religion should be definitive. Is that the contradiction to which you're pointing?
Or I guess more in the framing of this course, as we're trying to look back at the sort of original version of Christianity or original version of a form, isn't there a sort of a tension in trying to find that original version? Are we saying that the original version was different? Or are we saying the original version was better?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the person you should ask that question to, because of course I'm not a Christian, I'm not a believer. And what I actually believe is that the gates of prophecy are always open, and that Christianity and religion in general are ripe for another revolution. A religious revolution, not just a political revolution. So that's what I believe. So I'm not going to be the one that to say that the early canonical form of Christianity should be reified and that somehow contradicts the idea that everything changes. It's not what I think. So remember my claim that in the last several centuries, humanity has been living through a revolutionary period. The world has been on fire. The subject matter of this course is the personalist wing of that revolution. So it has a political wing, liberalism, socialism, democracy, the institutions, and that comes now and then into our conversation here. But our main concern here is with the personalist wing of that revolution.